Affective empathy. You're sitting across from someone crying. Not just tearing up, actually sobbing. And before you even process what they're saying, you feel it. Your chest tightens, your throat catches. Their grief becomes yours, uninvited, instant. You didn't choose this response. It just happened. This is affective empathy. It's not thinking about how someone feels. It's feeling it with them. Like their emotional state jumped across the space between you and landed in your body. No translation needed. No analysis required. Just raw, immediate resonance. It's biological. Your brain mirrors pain when you see it on someone's face. The same neural regions light up as if you were experiencing that pain yourself. Irrational. Automatic. The kind of empathy that makes you flinch when someone else gets hurt, even in a movie. But here's the problem. Affective empathy doesn't come with instructions. It floods you with emotion, but you don't automatically know what caused it or what the person needs. You feel their sadness, their fear, their anger. But you're drowning in their experience without a map. A friend loses their job, and suddenly you're carrying their anxiety home with you. A stranger on the train looks devastated, and your mood shifts without knowing why. You absorb the emotional weather of every room you enter. The sensitivity is a gift until it becomes a weight. And because it's involuntary, you can't turn it off. You can't decide to stop feeling what others feel. The only options are to manage the overflow or let it consume you. Some people build walls. Others learn to separate what's theirs from what they've absorbed. But the emotional contagion never fully stops. The danger isn't just exhaustion. It's losing yourself. When you feel everything everyone else feels, where do you end and they begin? That boundary collapses fast. And when it does, empathy stops being connection. It becomes fusion. And fusion erases you. Cognitive empathy. Someone tells you they're upset. Their face is blank. No tears. No raised voice. Just a calm statement. I'm really struggling right now. Most people would miss it. But you don't. Because you're not reading the surface. You're tracking what's underneath. This is cognitive empathy. It's not about feeling their emotions. It's about understanding them. You notice the pause before they spoke, the tightness in their posture, the way they're choosing words too carefully. You're reading the blueprint of their internal state without experiencing it yourself. It's strategic. The ability to step into someone's perspective, map out their thoughts, predict their reactions. You don't have to feel what they feel to know what they're going through. You just have to think through their situation clearly. Like solving a puzzle where the pieces are someone else's motivations and fears. This is what lets a therapist stay grounded while their client falls apart. What lets a negotiator anticipate the other side's position without getting emotional. It's detachment with precision. You see the shape of their experience without being pulled into it. But without affective empathy, cognitive empathy can turn cold. You understand someone's pain perfectly, but you don't care. You know exactly what they need, but you have no drive to provide it. The insight is there. The compassion isn't. This is why some of the most manipulative people are also the most empathically accurate. They read you flawlessly. They know what words will land, what buttons to push, what vulnerabilities to exploit. They have cognitive empathy in excess. What they lack is the emotional pull to use it kindly. In workplaces, cognitive empathy is praised. It's professional, controlled. You can manage a team, navigate conflict, make decisions without getting emotionally compromised. But taken too far, it turns people into instruments. You optimize outcomes without feeling the human cost. Cognitive empathy alone doesn't connect you to people. It just makes you better at predicting them. And prediction without care is how you end up treating others like systems to manage instead of people to respect. Empathic distress. Your friend is breaking down. They're telling you something terrible, something that crushed them, and you want to help. But you can't. Because the moment they started talking, their pain hit you so hard you can't think. Your hands shake. Your breathing tightens. You're not comforting them. You're frozen. You meant to be there for them. Instead, you became another person who needs support. This is empathic distress. It's what happens when feeling someone else's pain becomes so overwhelming that it disables you. You're not connecting with them anymore. You're collapsing under the weight of what they're carrying. And now they have to manage both their crisis and your reaction to it. The mechanism is simple. When empathy floods your system faster than you can process it, your brain treats it like a threat. Fight or flight kicks in. Except there's nothing to fight and nowhere to run. So you freeze, or you pull away, or you try to make it stop by shutting the conversation down, not because you don't care, but because you can't handle it. A parent watches their child suffer and feels so much anguish they can't stay in the room. A nurse sees trauma every shift and starts avoiding patients because the emotional load is unbearable. The empathy is real, but it's turned inward, trapping you in your own distress instead of helping the person in front of you. And here's the paradox. The more you care, the worse it gets. High empathy doesn't always mean better support. Sometimes it means you're too destabilized to be useful. You feel everything, but you can't do anything. The sensitivity that was supposed to connect you to others ends up isolating both of you. Empathic distress doesn't make you selfish. It just makes you incapable. And the worst part is, the person suffering can see it. They watch you crumble and realize they can't lean on you. So they stop sharing. Not because you don't care, but because caring broke you. Compassion fatigue. You used to feel something when people told you their problems. Now you don't. Someone's crying in front of you, and all you can think is, I need this to end. It's not that you stopped caring. It's that you've run out of the capacity to care. This is compassion fatigue, the slow erosion of empathy that happens when you've absorbed too much suffering for too long. Therapists, nurses, social workers, even just people who are always the one others turn to. At some point, the well runs dry. It doesn't announce itself. You don't wake up one day and decide to stop caring. It creeps in. You start feeling numb during conversations that used to move you. You catch yourself mentally checking out while someone's talking. You avoid certain people because you know they'll need something from you, and you have nothing left to give. The guilt makes it worse. You know you should care. You know they're in pain. But when they start talking, all you feel is exhaustion. And then you feel terrible for feeling exhausted. The cycle tightens. Here's what's happening. Empathy is a resource, and like any resource, it depletes. Every time you absorb someone's pain, process their emotions, hold space for their crisis, you're drawing from a limited reserve. If you never refill it, eventually there's nothing left. Your brain starts protecting itself by shutting down emotional responsiveness. It's not cruelty. It's survival. Healthcare workers see this constantly. After months of back-to-back trauma cases, they stop reacting. A patient's suffering that would have devastated them a year ago now barely registers. They're not heartless. They're empty. And the emptiness feels like failure. But it's not just professionals. Anyone in a caregiving role, formal or informal, can hit this wall. The friend everyone calls in a crisis. The partner who always has to be strong. The child managing a parent's emotions. When your identity becomes the person who helps, you don't stop until there's nothing left of you to give. Compassion fatigue doesn't mean you're broken. It means you've been overextended for too long without recovery. And if you don't recognize it, you'll keep pushing until empathy stops being something you offer and starts being something you resent. Emotional contagion. Walk into a tense meeting. Nobody said anything yet, but you can feel it. The air is tight. Within minutes, your shoulders are up, your jaw is clenched, and you're anxious without knowing why. You didn't choose to feel this way. You caught it. Emotions spread. Like a virus, they jump from person to person without anyone noticing. One person's anxiety becomes the room's anxiety. One person's anger shifts the whole mood. You think your feelings are your own, but half the time you're just reflecting what's around you. This is emotional contagion. The automatic unconscious transfer of emotions between people. It happens faster than thought. Someone smiles and you smile back without deciding to. Someone's stressed, and suddenly you're stressed too. You're not empathizing. You're mirroring. And it's completely involuntary. The mechanism runs on mirror neurons. When you see an expression, your brain fires the same patterns as if you were making that expression yourself. Sadness, joy, fear, they don't stay contained. They leak. And your nervous system picks them up and reproduces them before your conscious mind even registers what's happening. This is why one person's bad mood can ruin a whole office. Why a crying baby on a plane makes everyone tense. Why you leave certain gatherings drained even when nothing bad happened. You absorbed everyone else's emotional state, and now you're carrying it. It's useful sometimes. Emotional contagion builds group cohesion. When everyone feels the same way, coordination is easier. Celebrations feel bigger. Grief feels shared, but it's a double-edged blade. Because you also catch the emotions you don't want. The irritation, the despair. The quiet resentment no one's voicing but everyone's feeling. And here's the problem. Most people don't realize it's happening. They think their sudden shift in mood is about them. They don't see that they walked into a space heavy with someone else's emotion and took it on as their own. So they act on feelings that were never theirs to begin with. Emotional contagion doesn't ask for permission. It just happens. And once you're infected, the feeling is real, even if the source was someone else entirely. Perspective taking. You think you understand what they're going through. You've been there, or at least somewhere close. So when they explain their struggle, you map it onto your own experience and assume you've got it. You tell them what worked for you. You offer advice based on how you would feel, and you completely miss what they actually need. Because you weren't understanding their perspective. You were projecting yours. Perspective taking is supposed to be the cognitive side of empathy. The ability to step into someone else's viewpoint and see the world through their eyes. But most people don't actually do that. They imagine how they would feel in that situation, which is not the same thing. It's ego dressed up as empathy. Real perspective taking requires setting yourself aside. Not asking, how would I feel? But how do they feel given who they are, what they value, and what they've been through? It's harder than it sounds. Because your brain defaults to your own framework, your assumptions, your biases, your history. A manager thinks they're being empathetic by offering flexibility to a struggling employee, assuming they need rest. But the employee doesn't want time off. They want to feel competent again, to prove they can still do the job. The manager projected their own response to stress and missed what the person actually needed. This happens constantly in relationships. Someone says they're upset. Instead of asking what's wrong, you assume you know. You explain why it's not that bad. You offer solutions they didn't ask for. You invalidate their experience because it doesn't match how you think they should feel. And you do it believing you're being supportive. The failure isn't malicious. It's structural. Perspective taking is effortful. It requires you to suppress your own viewpoint long enough to genuinely consider someone else's. And most people don't have the cognitive bandwidth to do that consistently. So they take shortcuts. They substitute their perspective for the other person's and call it empathy. True perspective taking means accepting that someone can feel completely differently than you would in the same situation, and that doesn't make them wrong. It means listening without planning your response. It means resisting the urge to fix, advise, or reassure until you actually understand what they're experiencing. Most of the time, we don't. We think we do. And that gap between what we think we understand and what's actually happening is where empathy falls apart. Empathic accuracy. You think you know what they're feeling. You've been watching them all day, reading their body language, tracking their tone. When they finally tell you what's wrong, you're already nodding. You saw it coming. Except you didn't. What they actually say is nothing like what you assumed. Your read was completely off. Empathic accuracy is how well you actually understand what someone else is thinking or feeling. Not what you think they're feeling. What they're actually experiencing. And most people are worse at this than they realize. The gap between perceived accuracy and actual accuracy is enormous. You believe you're reading someone correctly because their behavior fits a pattern you recognize. But that pattern is based on your experience, not theirs. So you project your interpretation onto them and mistake it for insight. A coworker seems withdrawn, and you assume they're upset about the project feedback. You're wrong. They just found out their parent is sick. You read the mood correctly but missed the cause entirely. And because you were confident in your read, you responded in a way that made things worse. Here's what makes empathic accuracy so difficult. People don't broadcast their internal states clearly. They mask. They downplay. They say one thing and mean another. And even when they're being direct, their words are filtered through context you don't have access to. You're trying to decode a signal you're only partially receiving. The people who are best at empathic accuracy don't rely on assumptions. They ask questions. They check their interpretations. They stay uncertain long enough to gather real information instead of filling gaps with guesses. Because confidence isn't the same as accuracy. And the moment you stop questioning your read, you stop being accurate. Empathic accuracy isn't about feeling deeply. It's about seeing clearly. And most of the time, what you think you're seeing is just a reflection of what you expect to see. Selective empathy. Your neighbor's house burns down and you feel terrible. You offer help, donate money, check in regularly. A week later, you scroll past a news story about families losing their homes across the country. Thousands of people. You feel nothing. You keep scrolling. It's not that you don't care about suffering. You just don't care about all suffering equally. And that selectivity isn't random. It follows a pattern. The closer someone is to you, the more empathy you feel. Distance, whether physical, social, or emotional, kills compassion. This is selective empathy. Your capacity to care is limited, so your brain rations it. Family gets priority. Friends come next. Strangers barely register. It's efficient, but it's also a moral filter that operates below conscious awareness. You don't decide who deserves your empathy. Your brain decides for you based on proximity and similarity. A disaster kills dozens in your city, and it dominates your thoughts for days. The same disaster happens overseas, and you barely notice. The suffering is identical. The distance isn't. And that distance doesn't just reduce empathy, it erases it. The mechanism is simple. Empathy evolved to strengthen bonds within small groups, not to care about everyone equally. So your brain treats people outside your circle as abstractions. Numbers. Statistics. You know intellectually that they're suffering, but you don't feel it. And without feeling, there's no drive to act. Selective empathy explains why people can be incredibly compassionate in their personal lives and completely indifferent to large-scale suffering. It's not hypocrisy. It's how the system is built. Empathy was never designed to scale. You care about the people you can see. Everyone else is background noise. And the uncomfortable truth is, you're fine with that. Cold empathy. They know exactly how you feel. They can tell when you're anxious, when you're lying, when you're vulnerable. And they use it. Not to comfort you. to control you. Because understanding someone's emotions doesn't mean you care. Sometimes it just means you know where to aim. Cold empathy is the ability to read people without feeling for them. It's cognitive empathy stripped of compassion. You map someone's internal state with precision, but there's no warmth behind it. No drive to help. Just calculation. This is what separates a con artist from a caregiver. Both can read you accurately. Both understand what you need to hear. The difference is intent. The caregiver uses that understanding to support you. The con artist uses it to exploit you. And from the outside, they can look identical until it's too late. Psychopathy research shows this clearly. People with psychopathic traits often score high on cognitive empathy tests. They're excellent at perspective taking. They know what you're thinking, what you're afraid of, what you want, but they score near 0 on affective empathy. They don't feel your pain. They just recognize it. And recognition without compassion is a weapon. You see this in manipulative relationships. Someone knows exactly what to say to make you doubt yourself, to keep you off balance, to make you feel guilty. They're not guessing. They've studied you. And every word is chosen because they know how it will land. That's cold empathy at work. The scariest part is how convincing it can be. Because someone with cold empathy can perform care. They say the right things. They mirror your emotions. They seem like they understand. And they do. They just don't care. Cold empathy is empathy without the humanity. And once you've been on the receiving end, you realize understanding alone means nothing. Empathy gap. You're calm right now. So when your friend tells you they panicked during a presentation, you can't quite grasp it. Just take a deep breath. You say, "It's not that big a deal." You mean well. But you're speaking from a state they weren't in. And that gap makes your advice useless. The empathy gap is the failure to understand how someone feels when you're in a different emotional state. When you're calm, you can't fully grasp panic. When you're well-fed, you underestimate hunger. When you're safe, you trivialize fear. Your current state blocks access to what other states feel like. This happens constantly. You tell someone with depression to just try harder, because when you're not depressed, effort feels simple. You tell someone in pain to relax, because when you're comfortable, tension seems like a choice. You're not being cruel. You just can't bridge the gap between where you are and where they are. The mechanism is cognitive. Your brain uses your current state as a reference point for understanding others. But emotions aren't intellectual. They're visceral. And when you're not experiencing them, you forget how totalizing they are. You remember the fact of the emotion, but not the force of it. A parent who's never been terrified can't fully understand their child's fear of the dark. They know the child is scared. But they don't feel the weight of that fear, so they minimize it. There's nothing to be afraid of. Technically true. Empathically useless. Hot-cold empathy gaps are even worse. When you're angry, you can't imagine being calm. When you're in love, you can't imagine falling out of it. So you make decisions in one state that you'll regret in another. And you assume others can easily shift states when you can't even do it yourself. The empathy gap doesn't make you heartless. It just makes you blind to states you're not currently in. And that blindness feels like clarity until you're the one who needs understanding and no one can reach you. Parochial empathy. A child drowns in your community and the whole town mourns. Vigils. Fundraisers. Weeks of collective grief. 1,000 children drown in another country and you scroll past the headline without stopping. Same tragedy. Different reaction. The only variable is which group they belong to. Parochial empathy is empathy that stops at the borders of your in-group, your family, your community, your country, your race, your politics. Anyone inside that circle gets your full compassion. Anyone outside barely registers. It's tribalism wearing the mask of care. This isn't conscious bias. You don't wake up and decide certain people matter less. It's automatic. Your brain categorizes people into us and them, and empathy follows that division. A member of your group suffers and it feels personal. An outsider suffers and it's just information. Sports fans understand this instinctively. A player on your team gets injured and you're devastated. A player on the other team gets the same injury and you barely notice. Some fans even cheer. The same harm produces opposite reactions based purely on tribal markers. That's parochial empathy in action. It gets darker when it intersects with real suffering. You care more about one homeless person in your neighborhood than 100 in another city. You donate to local charities and ignore global ones. You demand justice for crimes against your group and stay silent about identical crimes elsewhere. The circle of care contracts until only the familiar remains inside it. What makes this dangerous is how righteous it feels. You're not being selfish. You're being loyal, taking care of your own. The empathy feels genuine because it is genuine. It's just restricted. And that restriction is invisible to you because the people outside your circle don't feel real enough to notice. Parochial empathy isn't a failure of feeling. It's a failure of scope. You have all the compassion you need. You just aim it at an impossibly narrow target and call it morality. Compassion collapse. One person suffering in front of you and you want to help. 100 people suffering and you still care, but the urgency fades. 1,000, 10,000, 1,000,000, and somewhere in that climb the empathy shuts off. Not because you're cruel. Because your brain can't process mass suffering. So it stops trying. This is compassion collapse, the point where scale overwhelms empathy and you go numb. You read about a famine killing thousands, and you feel less than you did reading about one lost child. The math is backwards. More suffering should mean more compassion. Instead, it triggers shutdown. The mechanism is cognitive overload. Your brain evolved to care about individuals, not populations. One face, one story. One name, you can hold that. You can imagine their pain. But when the numbers grow, they stop being people and start being statistics. And statistics don't activate empathy. They activate fatigue. Aid organizations know this. That's why they show you one child in an ad, not 1,000. Because your brain will donate to save one identifiable victim, but ignore a crisis affecting millions. The identifiable victim effect is real. Specificity triggers compassion. Scale kills it. This is why genocides can happen while the world watches. It's not that people don't know. They know. The numbers are reported. The evidence is shown. But the scale is so massive that empathy collapses under the weight. Millions dead becomes a headline, not a call to action. You read it and move on because your brain has nowhere to put that much suffering. Compassion collapse doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're human. Your empathy has limits, and mass suffering exceeds those limits every time. The tragedy isn't that you stop caring. It's that the people suffering don't stop being real just because your brain stopped being able to hold them. Mirror response tendency. Watch someone yawn and within seconds you yawn too. They cross their arms, you cross yours. They lean forward, you lean forward. You're not copying them deliberately. Your body just mirrors what it sees. Automatic. Unconscious. A behavioral echo you didn't choose to send. This is mirror response tendency. The brain's reflex to imitate what it observes. It's not empathy in the emotional sense. It's physical synchronization. Your nervous system matches the other person's state without asking permission first. Posture, gestures, facial expressions, even breathing patterns. You absorb them and reproduce them. The mechanism runs on mirror neurons, cells that fire both when you perform an action and when you watch someone else perform it. See a smile, your face starts to smile. See tension, your muscles tighten. The line between observing and doing blurs at the neurological level. It happens everywhere. In conversations, you unconsciously match the other person's speech rate, volume, even accent. In meetings, the whole room's body language starts to align. One person shifts position, and within minutes, everyone's shifted. No one planned it. It just spread. Mirroring builds rapport. When people mirror each other, they feel more connected, more in sync. Salespeople use this deliberately. Therapists do it to build trust. Because when your body matches someone else's, your brain interprets it as alignment. Like minds think alike starts as like bodies move alike. But mirroring doesn't discriminate. You mirror anger as easily as calm. Anxiety as easily as confidence. You walk into a room where everyone's stressed and your shoulders rise before you even know why. The mirroring happens first. The awareness comes later, if at all. Here's the trap. You think your reactions are your own. You feel tense and assume it's because of something you're thinking. You don't realize you just mirrored the person across from you. So you act on emotions that were never yours to begin with. And because the mirroring is invisible, you never question where the feeling actually came from. Vicarious emotion. You're watching a movie. The character loses someone they love, and suddenly you're crying. Nothing happened to you. Your life is fine. But for those 2 hours, their grief became yours. You felt it as if it were real. And in that moment, it was. Vicarious emotion is feeling something through someone else's experience. Not because it's happening to you, but because you're watching it happen to them. Books, films, stories, even strangers on the street. You witness their emotional reality, and your brain generates a parallel version inside you. It's more than observation. It's simulation. When you see someone in pain, your brain doesn't just register the information. It runs a low-level version of that pain in your own system. Not as intense as the real thing, but real enough to produce a reaction. You wince. You tighten. You feel the shadow of what they're experiencing. This is why fiction works. You know the story isn't real, but your emotional system doesn't care. It responds to the pattern. Betrayal, loss, triumph, fear. The brain treats the narrative as experiential data and generates the corresponding feelings. You finish a tragedy feeling drained, not because anything bad happened to you, but because you lived it vicariously. The same mechanism drives empathy in real life. Someone tells you about their breakup, and you feel the ache of it even though you're not the one being left. A friend describes their humiliation, and shame rises in your chest. You're running their emotional script in your own head, and the feelings it produces are genuine. But vicarious emotion has limits. The intensity fades with distance. You feel more watching someone suffer in person than reading about it. You feel more reading about one person than hearing statistics about thousands. The closer the experience, the stronger the emotional resonance. The farther away, the easier it is to stay detached. Vicarious emotion connects you to experiences you'll never have. But it also exhausts you with experiences that aren't yours. And sometimes, the line between feeling with someone and feeling for yourself disappears entirely. Empathy avoidance. Someone starts talking about something painful, and you feel it coming. The weight, the pull, the emotional demand. So you shut it down before it lands. You change the subject. You make a joke. You check your phone. Not because you're cruel, because you can't handle what's about to happen if you let it in. Empathy avoidance is the active refusal to engage with someone else's suffering. You see it. You know it's there. But you turn away because absorbing it feels like too much. It's self-protection disguised as indifference. The mechanism is simple. Your brain predicts the emotional cost of engagement and decides it's not worth paying. If you open yourself to their pain, you'll carry it. And you're already carrying enough. So you close the door before the feeling crosses the threshold. Not consciously. Just automatically. This shows up in relationships constantly. A partner tries to share their anxiety and you minimize it. It's not that bad. You'll be fine. You're not dismissing them to be mean. You're dismissing them because feeling their anxiety on top of yours would be unbearable. So you reduce the problem to make it smaller, easier, less threatening to your own emotional stability. Healthcare workers do this to survive. After years of exposure to trauma, they start emotionally distancing from patients. It's not that they stopped caring. It's that caring at full intensity would destroy them. So they ration empathy. They stay professional, detached, because the alternative is collapse. Empathy avoidance looks like coldness, but it's usually exhaustion. You've been asked to feel too much, too often, for too long. And now, when someone needs you to feel with them, you have nothing left to give. So you don't engage. You protect what's left of your own emotional reserves and let them carry their pain alone. The guilt makes it worse. You know you should be there for them. You know they need support. But the moment you imagine stepping into their experience, your whole system rejects it. So you stay distant, hating yourself for it, but unable to do anything else. Overidentification. Your friend is going through a divorce, and you can't stop thinking about it. You're not the one separating. But somehow their pain has taken over your life. You're losing sleep. You're canceling plans. You can't focus on anything else because their crisis has become yours. You're not supporting them anymore. You're drowning with them. This is overidentification. When empathy stops being connection and becomes fusion, you don't just feel for them. You lose the boundary between their experience and yours. Their problem is your problem. Their emotions are your emotions. And now you're so tangled up in their struggle that you can't tell where they end and you begin. The mechanism is boundary collapse. Empathy requires some separation. You feel with them, but you stay anchored in your own perspective. Overidentification erases that anchor. You step so far into their reality that you forget how to step back out. And once the boundary dissolves, their suffering floods your system without a filter. This happens most often with people you're close to. A parent overidentifies with their child's failure and feels the shame as if it's their own. A friend overidentifies with someone's rejection and internalizes the hurt. You're not just witnessing their pain. You're living it. And because you're living it, you react as if it's happening to you. But overidentification doesn't help. When you're drowning in their emotions, you can't pull them out. You just add your panic to theirs. They need someone grounded. Someone who can hold space without collapsing. Instead, they get someone who's just as destabilized as they are. And now they're managing both their crisis and your reaction to it. The irony is that overidentification feels like deep empathy. You think you're being incredibly supportive. You're not. You're being consumed. And the person you're trying to help can feel the difference. They watch you spiral and realize they can't lean on you because you're not stable enough to hold them. Overidentification doesn't make you a better friend. It just makes you another casualty. Boundaries in empathy. There's a version of empathy that leaves you intact. You feel what they're feeling, but you don't lose yourself in it. You stay present without drowning. You care without collapsing. It's not coldness. It's structure. The ability to be with someone's pain without making it your own. Boundaries in empathy are what separate connection from fusion. You recognize where you end and they begin. You hold space for their emotions without absorbing them into your system. It's not about feeling less. It's about feeling clearly. You know what's theirs, what's yours, and where the line sits between the two. This is what therapists are trained to do. They sit with intense suffering every day, but they don't take it home. Not because they don't care, because they've built the capacity to be present without merging. They feel the weight of what the person is carrying, but they don't pick it up and carry it themselves. The skill is subtle. It's not detachment. You're not pulling away emotionally. You're staying close while maintaining a psychological separation. You can sit in the room with someone's grief, acknowledge it, validate it, and still leave the room without it clinging to you. The boundary allows you to show up again tomorrow instead of burning out today. Most people don't have this skill. They think empathy means total immersion, so they either over-identify and get consumed, or they shut down completely to protect themselves. The middle ground, empathy with boundaries, feels impossible. But it's not. It's just practice, learning to feel without losing your center. Boundaries don't make you less compassionate. They make you sustainable. Because empathy without limits isn't noble. It's just a faster route to depletion. And once you're depleted, you're useless to everyone, including yourself. You can care deeply and still walk away whole. That's not a failure of empathy. It's the only way empathy survives long-term. Moral elevation. You see someone do something kind. A stranger helps an elderly person across the street. Someone donates anonymously to a family in need. A coworker stands up for someone being treated unfairly. It's not about you. You're just watching. But something shifts inside. A warmth. A pull. The sudden urge to be better, do better, help more. This is moral elevation. The emotional response to witnessing virtue. It's not empathy in the usual sense. You're not feeling someone else's pain. You're feeling inspired by their goodness. And that inspiration doesn't just sit there. It moves you. Toward action. Toward generosity. Toward becoming the kind of person who does what you just saw. The mechanism is distinct. When you witness moral beauty, your body responds physiologically. Warmth in the chest. A slight tearing up. A sense of expansion. It's not sadness. It's all directed at human decency. And that all creates a behavioral pull. You want to pay it forward. The goodness you witnessed becomes a template you want to follow. This is why stories of heroism spread. Why acts of kindness go viral. They don't just inform. They elevate. You read about someone risking their life to save a stranger, and for a moment, you feel the possibility of being that selfless. The elevation doesn't last long, but while it's active, it lowers the barrier to prosocial behavior. You're more likely to help, more likely to donate, more likely to act with kindness yourself. Moral elevation is contagious in the best way. One act of decency witnessed can trigger a chain. You see generosity, you feel elevated, you act generously, someone else sees it, and the cycle continues. It's the opposite of emotional contagion spreading negativity. This spreads the impulse to be good. But the feeling fades fast. Elevation is a spike, not a plateau. You watch something moving, you feel the warmth, and then you go back to your day. The inspiration dissolves unless you act on it immediately. And most of the time, you don't. You feel good about humanity for a moment, and then the moment passes. Still, elevation matters. Because even a brief window where you want to be better is a window where change is possible. And sometimes that's enough. Tenderness response. A child falls and starts crying. Before you think, something softens in you. Your voice drops. Your posture opens. You move toward them slowly, gently, like approaching something fragile. It's not pity. It's not obligation. It's a pull toward care that feels almost physical. That's the tenderness response. A specific kind of empathy triggered by vulnerability. When you see someone small, hurt, or defenseless, your system shifts into protective mode. Not aggressive protection. Soft protection. The instinct to soothe, to comfort, to make the world less harsh for someone who can't handle its full weight. It's hardwired. Babies, injured animals, anyone visibly struggling, they activate this response automatically. Your heart rate slows. Your muscles relax. Your focus narrows to their needs. The brain is running a caregiving program, and it doesn't ask for conscious approval first. You see it everywhere. A stranger helps a lost child find their parent, and there's no hesitation. Just immediate, gentle assistance. A nurse speaks to an elderly patient with softness they wouldn't use with someone younger. The vulnerability signals tenderness, and tenderness shapes the interaction. But here's what makes it complicated. The tenderness response is selective. It activates for certain kinds of vulnerability and not others. A crying child gets it. A homeless adult asking for help might not. The same need, but one triggers the caregiving instinct and the other doesn't. The difference is often just how the vulnerability presents. Tenderness can also be manipulated. People learn which behaviors trigger it. Play weak, play hurt, play helpless, and others soften toward you. It's not always conscious, but the response is real and it works. You lower your guard. You give more. You forgive faster. All because the vulnerability signal told your brain this person needs gentleness, not scrutiny. The tenderness response isn't wrong. It's what makes care possible. But it's also a lever. And once you see how it operates, you realize how often it's shaping your reactions without you noticing. Protective detachment. You can't afford to feel everything, so you build a filter. Not complete shutdown, just distance. Enough separation that you can function around suffering without being paralyzed by it. You stay aware, you stay capable. But you don't let it consume you. Protective detachment is the deliberate creation of emotional space. You see the pain. You recognize it, but you don't absorb it. It's not coldness, it's survival. Because if you felt the full weight of every difficult thing you encountered, you'd collapse. Emergency responders do this instinctively. A paramedic arrives at a scene, and there's chaos, blood, panic. They don't freeze. They don't break down. They assess, they act, they stabilize. Not because they don't care, because caring in the moment would make them useless. So they detach just enough to think clearly while still doing the work that needs to be done. The mechanism is controlled dissociation. You separate your emotional response from your functional response. The emotions are still there, running in the background, but you're not letting them drive. You're operating from a part of your brain that can stay rational under pressure. It's compartmentalization as a skill, not a disorder. Teachers use it daily. A student shares something heartbreaking, and the teacher responds with empathy. But they don't carry that weight into the next class, the next student, the next crisis. They reset. They have to. Otherwise, the accumulation would bury them. But protective detachment has a cost. The more you practice it, the easier it becomes. And eventually, the distance you built as protection starts feeling like your default. You stop turning it off. You stay detached even when you don't need to be. The boundary that was supposed to help you becomes a wall that isolates you. It's useful until it isn't. And the line between protecting yourself and cutting yourself off is thinner than most people realize. Compassion satisfaction. You help someone and it feels good. Not just morally good, genuinely satisfying. Like you did something that mattered. The exhaustion is still there, but underneath it there's fulfillment. A sense that the effort was worth it. That you made a difference. That this is why you do the work. This is compassion satisfaction. The positive feeling that comes from meaningful caregiving. It's the emotional reward for empathy in action. And it's what keeps people in helping professions from burning out completely. Because even when the work is hard, this feeling reminds them why it matters. It's not the same as praise or recognition. You don't need anyone to thank you. The satisfaction comes from the act itself. You see someone's pain lessen because of what you did, and something clicks. A sense of purpose. Of alignment. Like you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, even if it's difficult. Healthcare workers who report high compassion satisfaction don't burn out as fast. They're dealing with the same trauma, the same hours, the same emotional load. But they're also getting something back. A feeling of contribution, of being useful in a way that resonates. It's not enough to erase the fatigue, but it's enough to make the fatigue bearable. The key is impact. If you're helping but never seeing the results, compassion satisfaction doesn't develop. You pour yourself out and nothing comes back. But when you witness the change, when you see that your care actually helped, that feedback loop sustains you. It tells your brain that this effort has value. The danger is when the satisfaction stops, when the work becomes mechanical. When you're still doing everything right, but the emotional reward has faded. That's when empathy starts feeling like labor instead of purpose. And once it feels like labor, the countdown to burnout accelerates. Compassion satisfaction isn't automatic. It requires connection, feedback, and the ability to recognize that what you're doing is making a real difference. Without it, even the most dedicated people eventually run dry. Empathic concern. Someone's in pain, and you feel the urge to help. Not because you're feeling their pain yourself. You're not collapsing under the weight of their suffering. You're separate, stable but moved. You see what they need, and you want to provide it. That's the distinction. You're not drowning with them. You're reaching in to pull them out. Empathic concern is care without merging. You recognize someone's distress, you feel concern for their well-being, but you stay grounded in your own emotional state. It's outward-focused empathy. You're not simulating their pain in your own body. You're observing it and responding with a desire to alleviate it. This is different from affective empathy. With affective empathy, you catch the emotion. You feel sad because they feel sad. With empathic concern, you feel concerned because they feel sad. The emotional experience is different. One is contagion. The other is compassion. Research shows empathic concern is what drives prosocial behavior. When you feel empathic concern, you're more likely to help. You're motivated to reduce their suffering, not to escape your own discomfort. The action comes from care, not from the need to stop feeling bad yourself. Parents show this constantly. A child is upset, and the parent doesn't break down. They stay calm. They soothe. They problem solve. They're concerned, deeply concerned, but they're not destabilized. That separation is what allows them to actually be helpful instead of just another emotional mess the child has to manage. But empathic concern requires energy. You can't feel it for everyone all the time, so your brain rations it. You feel empathic concern for people you're close to, for situations you can actually affect, for problems that feel solvable. When the need is too big, too distant, or too overwhelming, empathic concern shuts down. Not because you're heartless, because your brain knows it can't help, so it stops generating the motivation to try. Empathic concern is empathy at its most functional. It connects care to action. But it's fragile, and when it fades, what's left is either indifference or distress, neither of which helps anyone. Personal distress. You're supposed to be comforting them. Instead, you're the one who needs comforting. Their pain hits you so hard you can't think straight. Your heart's racing. Your hands are shaking. You want to help, but all you can do is try to escape the feeling flooding your system. You're not supporting them. You're panicking alongside them. Personal distress is empathy that backfires. Instead of motivating you to help, it immobilizes you. You feel their suffering, but instead of turning that feeling outward into care, you turn it inward into self-protection. The emotion is too much, so your priority shifts from helping them to making yourself feel better. The mechanism is emotional overload. When someone else's pain enters your system at full intensity, your brain treats it like a threat. Fight or flight activates. But there's nothing to fight and no real escape. So you freeze. Or you flee the situation entirely. Not because you don't care. Because the feeling is unbearable. This is why some people avoid hospitals, funerals, or any situation where suffering is visible. It's not that they're selfish. It's that they know they'll be overwhelmed. The distress will be so intense they won't be able to function. So they stay away, protecting themselves from an emotional reaction they can't manage. Personal distress looks like empathy from the outside. You're crying. You're visibly affected. But the direction is wrong. Empathy should move you toward the person suffering. Personal distress moves you away. You're so focused on managing your own reaction that you lose sight of theirs. And here's the cruel part. The more you care, the more vulnerable you are to personal distress. High empathy doesn't always mean better support. Sometimes it just means you're more likely to be incapacitated by someone else's pain. You feel everything, but that flood of feeling makes you useless. Personal distress is empathy without the structure to handle it. And when it hits, the person who needed your support is left managing both their crisis and your collapse. Sympathy. They tell you their dog died and you say, "I'm so sorry." That's awful, you mean it. You feel bad for them. But you're not feeling what they're feeling. You're observing their pain from a safe distance and acknowledging it. That's sympathy. And it's not the same as empathy, no matter how often the words get used interchangeably. Sympathy is feeling for someone. Empathy is feeling with them. With sympathy, you recognize their suffering and you care about it, but you're not absorbing it into your own emotional state. You stay separate. You stay outside their experience. And that separation is the whole point. It's a less intense response. You see someone crying over a loss and you feel pity. Concern, maybe sadness on their behalf. But you're not crying with them. You're not running a simulation of their grief in your own system. You're witnessing it and responding with kindness, but the emotional barrier stays intact. Sympathy is often what people actually want. When you're suffering, you don't always need someone to feel exactly what you're feeling. Sometimes you just need acknowledgement. I see that you're in pain. I'm sorry you're going through this. That's sympathy. And it's enough. The problem is when sympathy gets mistaken for deep connection. You think you understand what someone's going through because you feel sorry for them. But feeling sorry isn't the same as understanding. Sympathy can be shallow. You're sad that something bad happened to them, but you haven't actually entered their reality. You're just standing at the edge looking in. Sympathy is also easier to fake. You can perform sympathy without feeling anything. The right words, the right expression, the right tone. It looks like care. But there's nothing behind it. Empathy is harder to fake because it requires genuine emotional engagement. Sympathy just requires the appearance of it. Still, sympathy has its place. It's sustainable. You can feel sympathy for many people without exhausting yourself. It's polite, appropriate, and often exactly what the situation calls for. You don't need to merge with everyone's pain to be kind. Sometimes, acknowledgement from a distance is all that's needed. Sympathy isn't lesser than empathy. It's just different. And knowing the difference keeps you from confusing the performance of care with the reality of it. Mercy motivation. They did something wrong. You know it. They know it. There's a rule, a line, a standard, and they crossed it. You could hold them to it. You'd be justified. But instead, something in you pulls toward leniency. Not because the rule doesn't matter. Because the person does. That pull is mercy motivation. The impulse to soften judgment when you see someone's humanity clearly enough that punishment feels wrong. It's not excusing the behavior. It's recognizing that the person who did it is more than the worst thing they've done. And that recognition shifts how you respond. The mechanism is empathy overriding justice. When you see someone as a full person, context, struggles, vulnerabilities, the impulse to punish weakens. You don't stop seeing the harm. You just start seeing the person who caused it as someone capable of being better. And that possibility makes mercy feel more productive than retribution. Parents do this constantly. A child breaks a rule, and the parent could enforce consequences strictly. But they see the fear in the child's eyes, the regret, the confusion. And instead of punishment, they choose teaching. Not because the rule doesn't matter, because the relationship matters more. Judges show mercy when they see mitigating circumstances. A person stole food because they were starving. The law was broken, but the reason reshapes the response. Mercy doesn't ignore the crime. It weighs the crime against the full reality of the person who committed it. But mercy can be selective. You're more likely to extend it to people who remind you of yourself, to people whose circumstances you can imagine being in, to people you see as redeemable. The further someone is from you, socially, culturally, emotionally, the harder mercy becomes. It's easier to be harsh when you can't see the person clearly. Mercy motivation is empathy translating into clemency. But it's fragile, and the people who receive it are often the ones who needed it least. Helping urge. A stranger drops their groceries. Bags split, items rolling everywhere. You're 10 feet away. You don't know them. You're busy. But before you think, you're moving. Bending down. Picking things up. Helping without deciding to help. The action just happens. That automatic response is the helping urge. The immediate impulse to assist when you see someone struggling. It's not rational calculation. It's reflex. You see need, and your body moves toward it before your brain finishes processing what's happening. The trigger is visible distress combined with proximity. Someone falls and you reach out. Someone's lost and you stop to give directions. Someone's carrying too much and you offer to hold something. The closer you are, the stronger the urge. Distance kills it. You see the same struggle from across the street and the impulse fades. The mechanism is empathic arousal. Witnessing struggle creates mild discomfort in you. Helping relieves that discomfort. So the urge to help is partly about them and partly about regulating your own emotional state. You feel better when you've done something. The action serves both of you. But the helping urge is also selective. You help people who look like you more readily. You help in situations where the cost is low. You help when the need is clear and the solution is simple. Ambiguous need, high effort, or social distance, and the urge weakens. It's not that you're selfish. It's that the urge is designed for immediate, low-cost interventions, not sustained effort. The helping urge gets you to act fast. But it doesn't sustain action. Once the immediate crisis is resolved, the impulse fades. You help them pick up their groceries, but you're not following them home to make sure they're okay. The urge is a sprint, not a commitment. Still, those small moments matter. Most help isn't grand gestures. It's the accumulation of tiny assists that make the world slightly less harsh. The helping urge is what drives that. And without it, we'd all be walking past each other's struggles without breaking stride. Emotional resonance. One person in the room is anxious, and within minutes everyone's on edge. No one said anything. No one explained. But the feeling spread. The whole space tightened. You walked in calm and left tense, and you're not even sure why. That's emotional resonance. One person's state becoming the group's state without anyone noticing the transfer. It's more than contagion. Contagion is catching a single emotion. Resonance is synchronization. The group's emotional frequency aligns. You're not just mirroring one person. You're all vibrating at the same emotional pitch. And once that alignment happens, the feeling amplifies. One person's anxiety becomes collective anxiety. One person's excitement lifts the whole room. The mechanism is social attunement. Humans are wired to sync with the people around them. Heart rates align. Breathing patterns match. Emotional states converge. It happens unconsciously. A biological drive to create group cohesion. When everyone feels the same way, coordination is easier. Communication is smoother. The group functions as a unit. You see this at concerts. thousands of people feeling the same thing at the same time. The music is the trigger, but the resonance is what makes it overwhelming. You're not just hearing the song. You're feeling it with everyone else. And that collective emotional wave is bigger than anything you'd feel alone. Resonance also happens in families. One person's stress saturates the household. Everyone starts snapping at each other, not because anything happened to them individually, but because the emotional tone of the space shifted. The feeling is in the air, and you're breathing it in. But resonance can lock groups into destructive patterns. If the dominant emotion is fear, the whole group becomes risk-averse. If it's anger, the group becomes aggressive. The resonance doesn't care whether the emotion is productive. It just amplifies whatever's there. Emotional resonance connects people, but it also traps them. And once a group is locked into a particular emotional frequency, breaking out requires someone strong enough to disrupt the sync. Affective sharing. You're watching a movie alone and a character dies. You feel sad. But it's contained, manageable. Now imagine watching the same scene with someone you care about, both of you crying. And suddenly the sadness is bigger. Not because the scene changed, because you're feeling it together. Affective sharing is experiencing an emotion in the presence of someone else experiencing the same thing. It's not just parallel emotion. It's mutual amplification. When you share a feeling, it becomes more intense, more real, more meaningful. The emotion doesn't just exist in you. It exists between you. The difference is connection. Alone, emotions are private, internal. Shared, they become social. You validate each other's reactions. You give each other permission to feel fully. And that permission deepens the experience. You're not just sad. You're sad together. And that transforms the feeling from something you're enduring alone into something you're navigating as a pair. This is why people seek out others during intense emotional moments. Grief shared is grief acknowledged. Joy shared is joy multiplied. You don't just want someone to know how you feel. You want someone to feel it with you. Because when they do, the emotion becomes part of a relationship instead of just part of your internal state. Sports fans understand this instinctively. Watching your team win alone is satisfying. Watching with other fans is euphoric. The shared emotion creates collective identity. You're not just happy. You're part of something bigger than yourself. The feeling bonds you to everyone else in the room. But affective sharing requires vulnerability. You have to let someone see what you're feeling. And not everyone can do that. Some people keep emotions private, even in the presence of others. They're feeling it, but they're not sharing it. And without the sharing, the connection doesn't form. Affective sharing is what makes emotions relational instead of solitary. It's the difference between feeling and feeling together. And once you've experienced the depth that comes from sharing, feeling alone never quite feels like enough. Mentalising. Your coworker just said they're fine, but their voice was clipped. Their posture closed. They didn't make eye contact, so you don't believe them. So, you don't ask again. You just adjust. You give them space, because you're not reading their words. You're reading their mind. Mentalising is the process of inferring what someone else is thinking or feeling based on indirect cues. It's mind reading, but not the supernatural kind. It's using observable behavior to construct a mental model of someone's internal state. You watch what they do, how they say things, what they avoid, and from that, you guess what's happening inside their head. It's constant. Every conversation requires it. Someone pauses before answering, and you wonder what they're holding back. Someone avoids a topic, and you infer discomfort. Someone laughs too hard at a joke, and you suspect they're trying to cover something. You're not just hearing their words. You're interpreting the gap between what they're saying and what you think they mean. The skill develops early. By age 4, most children can pass false belief tests. They understand that someone else can believe something that isn't true, that other people have separate minds with separate information. And once you grasp that, you start trying to figure out what those minds contain. Mentalizing is what makes deception possible. You lie because you understand that the other person doesn't have direct access to your thoughts. You can say one thing while thinking another, and they'll only know what you choose to reveal. The ability to mentalize creates the possibility of manipulation. Because if you can predict what someone's thinking, you can shape what they think next. But mentalizing is also error-prone. You're guessing, and sometimes you guess wrong. You think someone's mad at you when they're just tired. You think someone's lying when they're just nervous. Your mental model of their mind is built on incomplete data, and the gaps get filled with assumptions, often wrong ones. The better you know someone, the more accurate your mentalizing becomes. You've seen their patterns. You know their defaults. You can read between the lines with more confidence. But even then, you're still guessing. You're just guessing with better information. Mentalizing is the foundation of social intelligence. But it's also the source of most misunderstandings. Because the mind you're reading isn't actually theirs. It's your reconstruction of theirs. And reconstructions are never perfect. Theory of mind. A child hides a toy in a box. Another child watches. Then the first child leaves. While they're gone, you move the toy to a drawer. When the first child comes back, where will they look for the toy? The box. Because they don't know it moved. They have a false belief. And the ability to understand that, to grasp that someone else's mind contains information different from yours, that's theory of mind. It's the cognitive capacity to attribute mental states to others. To recognize that other people have beliefs, desires, intentions, and knowledge that differ from your own. It's understanding that minds are separate. That what you know isn't automatically what everyone knows. That perspective is individual. Most children develop this around age 4 or 5. Before that, they assume everyone sees the world the way they do. If they know something, they think you know it too. They can't yet conceptualize that your mind holds different content than theirs. Once theory of mind kicks in, that changes. They realize you can think something false. You can want something they don't want. You can believe something that isn't true. And that realization transforms social interaction. Suddenly, deception makes sense. Secrets become possible. Manipulation becomes conceivable, because if you can model someone else's mind as separate from yours, you can start predicting their behavior based on what they believe, not what's actually true. People with impaired theory of mind struggle socially. Autism spectrum disorders often involve difficulty with this capacity. It's not that they don't care about others. It's that modeling another person's mental state doesn't come naturally. They take words literally because inferring unspoken meaning requires mentalizing. They miss social cues because reading between the lines requires assuming the other person's perspective is different from the observable facts. Theory of mind is also what makes empathy cognitively possible. You can't feel for someone if you don't first recognize that they have feelings separate from yours. The ability to attribute mental states is the foundation. Empathy builds on top of it. But having theory of mind doesn't guarantee you'll use it kindly. You can understand that someone else has feelings and still choose to hurt them. You can predict their reaction and exploit it. Theory of mind is morally neutral. It's a tool. And like any tool, it can be used to connect or to harm. Understanding that other minds exist is the beginning. What you do with that understanding is where empathy actually lives. Misempathy. Your friend seems distant, so you give them space. You're being considerate, respectful, letting them process whatever's going on without pressure. A week later, they tell you they felt abandoned. They needed you to reach out, not pull away. You thought you were reading them correctly. You were completely wrong. Misempathy is getting the emotional rid backwards. You think you understand what someone needs, but your interpretation is off. You're responding to a signal you're not actually receiving. And because you're confident in your rid, you act on it. The action feels empathetic. But it's the opposite of what the person actually needed. The problem is certainty. You see their behavior, you interpret it through your own framework, and you assume you've got it right. Silence means they want space. Irritability means they're angry at you. Withdrawal means they need distance. But those interpretations are based on what those signals would mean if you were displaying them, not what they mean for the other person. A parent sees their teenager pulling away and interprets it as rebellion, so they tighten restrictions. But the teenager wasn't rebelling. They were overwhelmed and needed room to breathe. The parent's response, intended to help, made everything worse. The empathy was real. The accuracy wasn't. Misempathy happens most often with people you're close to. You think you know them well enough to predict their needs. And sometimes you do, but familiarity can also breed assumptions. You stop checking your reads because you're so used to being right. And when your model of them becomes outdated or was never accurate to begin with, you keep responding to a version of them that doesn't exist. The fix is simple but difficult. Ask. Don't assume. When you think you know what someone needs, check. Because confidence in your empathic accuracy and actual empathic accuracy are not the same thing. And the gap between the two is where relationships fracture. Misempathy doesn't mean you don't care. It just means you're caring in the wrong direction. And sometimes that's worse than not caring at all. Empathy bias toward Ingroup. A member of your community gets attacked and you're outraged. You demand justice. You share the story. You donate to their recovery fund. The next day, the same thing happens to someone from a different group. Same crime. Same suffering. You scroll past. You don't share. You don't donate. The empathy you felt so strongly yesterday just isn't there. This is empathy bias toward your Ingroup. Your capacity to care is filtered through identity. People who share your background, your values, your markers, they get your full empathy. People outside that circle get significantly less. It's not a conscious choice. It's automatic sorting, as versus them. And empathy follows the division. The mechanism is tribal identification. Your brain categorizes people as either part of your group or not. In-group members are treated as extensions of yourself. Their pain feels personal. Out-group members are processed differently. Their suffering registers, but it doesn't activate the same emotional response. The empathy is there in theory. In practice, it's muted. You see this everywhere. Fans care more about injuries to players on their team than to opponents. Communities rally around local victims, but ignore identical suffering elsewhere. Political tribes empathize with their own and dismiss the other side's grievances as exaggerated or deserved. The same harm produces wildly different levels of concern based purely on group membership. The bias isn't just about proximity. It's about identity. You can feel more empathy for a stranger who shares your nationality than for a neighbor who doesn't. More for someone who votes like you than for a family member who doesn't. The in-group marker overrides everything else. And once it's activated, your empathy aligns with tribal boundaries instead of human ones. What makes this dangerous is how justified it feels. You're not being biased. You're being loyal, taking care of your own. The empathy feels genuine because it is genuine. It's just restricted to a circle you've drawn, often without realizing you drew it. Empathy bias toward in-groups isn't a failure of feeling. It's a failure of scope. You have the capacity to care. You just aim it at people who look, think, and believe like you. And everyone outside that circle becomes background noise. Victim identifiability effect. A charity shows you statistics. Thousands of children need clean water. Hundreds of families displaced by conflict. Tens of thousands facing starvation. The numbers are staggering. You feel bad, but you don't donate. The next ad shows you one child, a name, a face, a story. You donate immediately. This is the victim identifiability effect. Your empathy responds to individuals, not populations. One person with a face and a name activates compassion. Large numbers don't. They activate cognitive overload. Your brain can't hold the suffering of thousands, so it shuts down. But it can hold one. And that one person becomes the conduit for your care. The difference is specificity. Abstract suffering doesn't create the emotional pull needed to drive action. You know intellectually that thousands suffering is worse than one suffering. But your empathy doesn't do math. It responds to vividness, to concreteness, to the ability to imagine a single person's experience. And when the numbers grow too large, that ability collapses. This is why fundraising campaigns focus on individual stories. They don't show you the crisis. They show you the person the crisis is happening to. Because your brain will care about the person in a way it won't care about the statistic. The identified victim effect is so strong that people will donate more to save one named individual than to save a larger group of unnamed people. It's not rational. Saving 10 people is objectively better than saving one. But empathy isn't rational. It's triggered by proximity detail and the ability to mentally simulate someone's suffering. And you can't simulate 1,000 people at once. So your empathy latches onto the one you can see clearly and ignores the rest. The effect has consequences. Resources flow toward identifiable victims and away from statistical ones. Media coverage amplifies individual tragedies and glosses over mass suffering. The one missing child gets national attention. The thousands dying from preventable disease don't. Not because the individual suffering is greater, because it's easier to see. The victim identifiability effect isn't a moral failing, it's a feature of how empathy works. But it means the people who get help aren't always the people who need it most. They're just the ones whose suffering you can picture clearly enough to care. Narrative empathy. You're reading a book. The character loses someone they love. You've never experienced that loss. But your throat tightens. Your eyes water. For a moment, you're not in your chair. You're in their world, feeling what they feel. The story isn't real, but the emotion is. Narrative empathy is the capacity to feel for fictional characters. You know they don't exist. But your emotional system doesn't care. It responds to the structure of the experience. Betrayal, grief, triumph, fear. The narrative triggers the same empathic response you'd have for a real person. Because to your brain, the pattern is what matters, not the reality. This is why fiction works. Stories let you inhabit perspectives you'd never encounter in real life. You feel what it's like to be someone completely different. Different background, different struggles, different identity. And for the duration of the story, their reality becomes yours. You're not observing their emotions. You're running a simulation of them. The mechanism is transportation. When you're immersed in a narrative, your sense of self temporarily merges with the characters. You adopt their goals. You feel their setbacks. You celebrate their wins. The boundaries between you and them blur. And that blurring allows empathy to flow in ways it wouldn't for a stranger on the street. Narrative empathy can expand your capacity for real-world empathy. Reading stories about people unlike you builds the mental infrastructure for understanding perspectives you've never lived. It's practice. Safe practice. You can explore what it feels like to be someone else without the social stakes of an actual interaction. But narrative empathy is also selective. You empathize with characters the story frames as sympathetic. The protagonist, the victim, the underdog. Characters framed as antagonists get less. The narrative controls not just what you feel, but who you feel for. And that framing shapes your empathy as much as the content does. Narrative empathy proves that your emotional system can be activated by stories alone. No real person needs to be suffering for you to feel their pain. But it also shows how easily empathy can be directed. Tell the right story, and you can make people care about anyone. Tell the wrong one, and you can make them stop. Parasocial empathy. You've never met them. They don't know you exist. But you care about them. You worry when they're struggling. You celebrate when things go well for them. You feel connected, like you know them. Except the relationship is entirely one-sided. They're not your friend. They're a celebrity, an influencer, a public figure you follow. And the empathy you feel is real, but the relationship isn't. This is parasocial empathy. Emotional investment in someone who isn't invested in you. You've built a mental relationship with them based on the content they share. But it's a simulation. You're responding to a curated version of their life, not the full reality. And the empathy flows one direction. You feel for them. They don't even know you're there. The mechanism is exposure. The more you see someone, the more familiar they become, and familiarity breeds connection. Your brain doesn't distinguish between someone you see regularly on a screen and someone you see regularly in person. The repeated exposure creates the illusion of closeness. So you start caring about them as if they were part of your actual social circle. You see their struggles and you feel protective. You see their wins and you feel proud. When they face criticism, you defend them. When they fail, you're disappointed. The emotions are identical to what you'd feel for a real friend. But the relationship is asymmetric. You're emotionally invested. They're just producing content. Parasocial empathy isn't inherently harmful. It's how fan communities form, how people find role models, how public figures build loyalty. But it can also distort reality. You defend someone you don't actually know against accusations you haven't verified. You feel betrayed when they act in ways that contradict the version of them you've constructed. You're reacting to a person who only exists in your head. The danger is when parasocial empathy replaces real relationships. When you're more invested in the lives of people, you'll never meet than the people around you. When the curated personas on your screen feel more real than the messy, complicated humans in your life. Parasocial empathy is empathy without reciprocity. And empathy without reciprocity is just projection. You're not connecting with them. You're connecting with the idea of them. And that idea will never care back. Empathy-induced guilt. You see someone suffering. You feel for them. You understand their pain. And then, almost immediately, you feel something else. Guilt. Because you're not suffering. Because you have what they don't. Because you're fine and they're not. The empathy that was supposed to connect you to them becomes a reminder of the gap between you. And that gap feels wrong. Empathy-induced guilt is the discomfort that arises when you empathize with someone whose situation is worse than yours. You feel their pain, but you also feel the unfairness of your own comfort. And instead of motivating you to help, the guilt can paralyze you or push you away. Because the feeling is too uncomfortable to sit with. The mechanism is comparison. When you empathize, you're holding their reality next to yours. And if the gap is large, the contrast creates moral distress. Why do they have to suffer when you don't? What did you do to deserve better circumstances? The questions don't have satisfying answers. So the guilt lingers. You see a homeless person, and you feel empathy, but you also feel guilty for walking past them with money in your pocket. You hear about someone losing their job and you feel for them. But you also feel guilty for being employed. The empathy is real, but it's tangled with self-reproach. And that mixture is hard to process. Some people respond to empathy-induced guilt by helping. The guilt becomes motivation. They donate, volunteer, advocate. The action alleviates the discomfort. But others respond by avoiding. They stop engaging with the suffering because the guilt is unbearable. They turn away, not because they don't care, but because caring hurts too much. Empathy-induced guilt can also breed resentment. You feel guilty for having more, but you didn't cause their suffering. So the guilt starts to feel unfair, and that unfairness can turn into anger. At them for making you feel guilty, at yourself for not being able to fix it, at the situation for existing in the first place. Empathy-induced guilt isn't bad. It's a signal that something's unbalanced. But when the guilt becomes the focus instead of the person you're empathizing with, it stops being useful. Because at that point, you're not thinking about their needs. You're just managing your own discomfort. And empathy that centers your feelings isn't empathy anymore. Emotional labor of empathy. The customer is furious. You didn't cause the problem. You can't fix it. But you smile. You soften your voice. You absorb their anger without reacting. You make them feel heard, even though you stopped listening 3 minutes ago. By the time they leave, you're drained. Not from the work. From performing care you don't feel. This is emotional labor of empathy. The act of manufacturing empathic responses for professional or social purposes. You're not genuinely connecting. You're managing their emotions to keep the interaction smooth. It's empathy as a job requirement, and it exhausts you in ways physical labor never does. The demand is constant in service work. Flight attendants, nurses, teachers, customer service, therapists. You're expected to be warm, patient, understanding, regardless of how you actually feel. Your real emotions get suppressed. The performed ones take over, and maintaining that performance hour after hour, day after day, depletes you. The mechanism is self-regulation under pressure. You're monitoring your expressions, your tone, your body language, making sure nothing slips. The customer can be rude. You stay calm. The patient can be ungrateful. You stay compassionate. The effort isn't just emotional. It's cognitive. You're running 2 tracks simultaneously. What you feel and what you display. And keeping them separate requires energy. What makes it worse is the lack of reciprocity. You're giving empathy. You're not receiving it. The exchange is one way. They get your care. You get nothing back except the expectation to keep performing. And when empathy becomes a transaction, stops feeling like connection and starts feeling like exploitation. Emotional labor of empathy isn't optional in most jobs. It's part of the role. But it comes with a cost. The more you perform empathy you don't feel, the harder it becomes to access empathy you do feel. The real thing starts to feel like work too. And eventually you're not sure what's genuine anymore. You can only fake care for so long before you stop being able to feel it at all. Co-regulation through empathy. A child is spiraling, crying, panicking, completely overwhelmed. You don't match their energy. You don't tell them to calm down. You just stay calm yourself. Your breathing slows. Your voice steadies. And gradually, without you saying much, they start to settle. Your calm becomes their calm. Not through instruction. Through presence. This is co-regulation through empathy. Using your own emotional state to stabilize someone else's. You're not absorbing their distress. You're offering them a different frequency to sync with. And because emotions are contagious, your steadiness pulls them out of their spiral. The process is bidirectional. They're dysregulated. You stay regulated. They unconsciously mirror your state. Their breathing matches yours. Their heart rate starts to align. The panic doesn't disappear instantly, but it stops escalating. Your nervous system is lending stability to theirs. Parents do this instinctively. A toddler falls and starts crying. The parent stays calm, speaks softly, holds them gently. The child's distress peaks, then fades. Not because the parent solved anything, because the parent's regulated state gave the child something to anchor to. The emotional storm had a ground wire. Co-regulation works in adults too. You're anxious, and someone sits with you without trying to fix it. They're just present. Calm. And their calm starts to bleed into you. You're not alone in the feeling anymore, and having someone grounded nearby makes the feeling less consuming. But co-regulation requires one person to stay stable. If both people dysregulate, there's no anchor. The emotions amplify instead of settling. Two people in panic don't calm each other. They escalate each other. Co-regulation only works when one person can hold the center. It's one of the most powerful uses of empathy, not feeling what they feel, but offering them a way out of what they're feeling. Your steadiness becomes the map back to theirs. Compassion training orientation. Some people treat empathy like a fixed trait. You either have it or you don't. But empathy isn't static. It's a skill. And like any skill, it can be trained. Compassion training orientation is the approach that views empathy as something you build through practice, not something you're born with. The training doesn't teach you to feel more intensely. It teaches you to direct your empathy more effectively, to recognize when you're over-identifying and pull back, to notice when you're detaching and re-engage, to sustain compassion without burning out. It's learning to use empathy as a tool instead of letting it use you. The methods are surprisingly practical. Meditation practices that focus on extending goodwill toward others. Perspective-taking exercises that build the habit of considering alternative viewpoints. Exposure to suffering in controlled doses to increase tolerance without overwhelming the system. It's not abstract. It's deliberate skill building. Healthcare systems have started adopting this. Hospitals train staff in compassion practices to reduce burnout. The training doesn't make the work less hard. It makes the workers more resilient. They learn to care without collapsing, to stay present with suffering without absorbing it. The empathy stays functional instead of becoming destructive. The key insight is that empathy isn't all or nothing. You can strengthen parts of it while managing others. You can increase your capacity for empathic concern while decreasing your vulnerability to empathic distress. The system is trainable. You just have to treat it like one. Critics argue that trained empathy isn't real empathy. That genuine compassion is spontaneous, not learned. But that's a romantic view. Empathy in the real world requires management. And if training helps people sustain it longer, serve more people, and avoid burning out, the artificiality argument feels hollow. Compassion training orientation doesn't promise to make you a saint. It just gives you the tools to be consistently kind without destroying yourself in the process. Empathy suppression. You're about to walk into a difficult conversation. You know it's going to be emotional. You know you'll want to comfort them. But you can't afford to feel it right now. So you shut it down. You block the empathic response before it starts. Not because you don't care. Because if you let yourself care, you won't be able to do what needs to be done. Empathy suppression is the deliberate inhibition of empathic responses. You see the suffering. You recognize it. But you stop yourself from feeling it. It's a conscious override. You're choosing not to engage emotionally because engagement would interfere with function. Doctors do this during surgery. If they empathized fully with the patient's pain, their hands would shake. They'd hesitate. They'd second guess. So they suppress. They focus on the procedure, not the person. The empathy gets temporarily turned off, so the technical skill can operate without interference. Empathy suppression isn't the same as not caring. You still want the best outcome for the person. But you've recognized that feeling their pain in the moment won't help them. So you compartmentalize. You create distance. You treat the situation as a problem to solve rather than a person to connect with. The ability to suppress empathy is necessary in high-stakes environments. Emergency responders can't afford to feel the full weight of every tragedy they witness. They'd be paralyzed. So they suppress in the moment and process later. The suppression is tactical, not permanent. But chronic suppression has consequences. The more you practice shutting down empathy, the easier it becomes. And eventually, you might not be able to turn it back on. The suppression that started as a coping mechanism becomes your default. You stop feeling even when you want to. Empathy suppression is a survival tool. But like any tool used too often, it changes you. And the person who can turn empathy off at will isn't always the same person who can turn it back on when it matters. Detached concern. You care about the outcome. You want them to be okay. But you're not emotionally invested in their suffering. You see it. You acknowledge it. You respond professionally. But you don't take it home with you. You don't lose sleep over it. You're concerned, but from a distance. And that distance is what lets you keep showing up. Detached concern is the balance point between empathy and self-preservation. You maintain enough emotional connection to motivate action, but not so much that it destabilizes you. It's care with boundaries. Professionalism with compassion. The sweet spot where you can help without being consumed. Medical training actively teaches this. Doctors learn to care about patients without becoming emotionally entangled. It's not coldness. It's sustainability. Because if you feel every patient's pain as your own, you'll last a year before burning out. Detached concern lets you last a career. The detachment isn't about not feeling. It's about not merging. You recognize their pain as theirs, not yours. You respond to it. You work to alleviate it. But you don't carry it. When the shift ends, you leave it at the hospital. The concern was real. The boundary was too. Critics call it callous. They argue that real empathy requires full emotional engagement. But that's an idealistic view that doesn't account for volume. When you're exposed to suffering daily, full engagement isn't noble. It's unsustainable. Detached concern is what allows sustained care over time. The challenge is finding the right level of detachment. Too much, and you become indifferent. Too little, and you burn out. The balance shifts depending on the situation. A terminal patient might warrant more emotional investment than a routine checkup. You modulate based on need and capacity. Detached concern isn't everyone's natural state. Some people have to learn it. Others have to fight against it becoming too detached. But for anyone in a caregiving role long-term, it's not optional. It's the only way empathy survives contact with reality. Moralized empathy. You don't just feel for them. You feel like you should. Empathy isn't just an emotion. It's a moral obligation. Good people care about others. Bad people don't. So when you don't feel empathy, you don't just notice the absence. You feel guilty. Like you've failed some ethical standard you can't quite name. This is moralized empathy. The belief that empathy is inherently virtuous and its absence is a moral failing. It elevates feeling into duty. You're not just encouraged to care. You're judged for not caring enough, and that judgment, internal or external, turns empathy into a performance of goodness. The problem is that empathy isn't always appropriate. Sometimes detachment is necessary. Sometimes self-preservation requires you to care less. But when empathy is moralized, those practical boundaries feel like ethical violations. You're not just protecting yourself. You're being selfish, heartless, less than. Moralized empathy also creates hierarchies. People who display empathy publicly are seen as better. Kinder. More evolved. People who don't are suspect. Cold. Possibly sociopathic. It's not enough to act ethically. You have to feel the right feelings while doing it. And those feelings have to be visible. This leads to performative empathy. You signal concern not because you feel it, but because you're supposed to. Social media thrives on this. Posting about tragedies. Sharing outrage. performing solidarity. The actual emotion is secondary. The display is what matters. Because if you don't perform, people assume you don't care. Moralized empathy also weaponizes the absence of feeling. If you don't cry at the right moments, something's wrong with you. If you don't feel devastated by every injustice, you're complicit. The pressure to feel becomes as important as the pressure to act. And when you can't summon the feeling, you fake it. Because the alternative is being labeled morally deficient. Empathy can motivate good actions. But when it becomes a moral requirement, it stops being about connection and starts being about judgment. And judgment doesn't make anyone more compassionate. It just makes them better at pretending. Witnessing pain response. You see someone get hurt, not on a screen, right in front of you. A real person, real pain. And before you think, your body reacts. You flinch. Your muscles tense. Your breath catches. You're not the one injured, but your system responds as if you were. The pain you're witnessing becomes pain you're experiencing, at least partially. This is the witnessing pain response. The automatic physiological reaction to observing someone else's suffering. Your brain doesn't just register that they're in pain. It simulates a version of that pain in your own neural pathways. Not as intense as the real thing, but real enough to produce a physical reaction. The response is involuntary. You can't decide not to flinch when you see someone fall. You can't suppress the wince when you watch someone get injured. The mirror system activates immediately. Same regions of the brain that process your own pain light up when you see someone else's. The boundary between observed pain and felt pain blurs at the neurological level. This is why medical students sometimes feel queasy during their first surgeries. They're watching procedures that would cause immense pain, and their brains are running low-level simulations of that pain. The rational knowledge that they're not the one being cut doesn't override the automatic response. Their bodies react to the witnessed trauma as if it were happening to them. The witnessing pain response has an evolutionary function. It makes you care about others getting hurt. If seeing someone injured produces discomfort in you, you're motivated to prevent injuries, to help when they happen, to avoid situations where pain occurs. The empathic response creates prosocial behavior, but the response can also be overwhelming. Watching too much suffering, especially graphic suffering, can traumatize you even though you're not the direct victim. Vicarious trauma is real. You can develop symptoms similar to PTSD from witnessing violence, even if you were never personally threatened. Your brain treated the observed pain as real enough to create lasting distress. The witnessing pain response is empathy at its most visceral. You're not thinking about their pain. You're feeling an echo of it. And that echo is what makes witnessing unbearable and caring unavoidable. Empathic burnout. At first, you cared deeply. Every person's story mattered. Every struggle moved you. You gave everything you had because the work felt meaningful. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. You started feeling nothing. The empathy you relied on just stopped showing up. Now you're going through the motions, and the emotional connection that made the work bearable is gone. Empathic burnout is the complete depletion of empathic capacity from prolonged exposure to others' suffering. It's not temporary exhaustion. It's systemic collapse. You've drawn from the well so many times without refilling it that there's nothing left. And now, when someone needs your compassion, you have none to give. It doesn't happen suddenly. It's a slow erosion. First, you stop feeling as much. Then you start resenting the demands on your empathy. Then you actively avoid situations that require emotional engagement. Finally, you're numb. People are talking, crying, struggling in front of you, and you feel nothing. Not because you're cruel. Because you're empty. Healthcare workers, therapists, social workers, teachers, anyone in chronic caregiving roles, they're vulnerable to this. The job requires constant empathic output. And if the system doesn't build in recovery time, the capacity depletes. You keep giving until there's nothing left to give. And when you hit empty, the switch doesn't gradually dim. It shuts off. The warning signs are predictable. You start dreading interactions that used to energize you. You feel irritated by people's needs. You catch yourself being short, dismissive, mechanical. You know you should care, but the feeling won't come. And the guilt from not caring makes everything worse. What makes empathic burnout different from compassion fatigue is totality. Compassion fatigue is exhaustion. You're tired, but you can still access empathy if you rest. Empathic burnout is depletion. Rest doesn't restore it. The system has been overdrawn for too long. Recovery requires more than a weekend off. It requires rebuilding capacity from zero. Empathic burnout doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you someone who gave until the giving mechanism broke. And once it breaks, caring stops being something you do and starts being something you remember doing. Resonance fatigue. You walk into a room and immediately you know something's off. The energy is heavy. People are tense. No one said anything, but you feel it. And within minutes, that tension is yours. You didn't bring it with you. You absorbed it. And by the end of the day, you're exhausted, not from anything you did, but from everything you felt. Resonance fatigue is the exhaustion that comes from constantly sensing with other people's emotional states. You're picking up frequencies all day long, matching them, adjusting to them, and the constant attunement drains you. Because you're not just managing your own emotions, you're managing echoes of everyone else's. The mechanism is emotional contagion on repeat. Every interaction is a small download. A stressed colleague makes you stressed. A depressed client leaves you feeling low. A frustrated customer transfers their frustration to you. Individually, the hits are manageable. But they accumulate. And by the end of a week, a month, a year, you're carrying emotional residue that isn't yours. People in service roles, open plan offices, crowded environments, they experience this constantly. You never get emotional silence. There's always someone nearby broadcasting a state you're unconsciously absorbing. And because the absorption is automatic, you can't turn it off. You just keep collecting everyone else's energy until you're saturated. The fatigue isn't physical, it's energetic. You haven't done anything strenuous, but you're wiped. Because emotional resonance requires processing. Your brain is constantly running background programs to decode and match the emotional signals around you. And those programs consume resources. Recovery requires isolation. Not permanent. Just enough time in a space where you're not picking up anyone else's frequency. Where your nervous system can reset to your baseline instead of someone else's. But for people who live in constant social environments, that isolation is hard to find. So the fatigue compounds. Resonance fatigue doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're porous. And in a world full of emotional noise, porousness is expensive. Affective overload. The first person's crisis you handled. The second you managed. By the third, you're starting to feel it. By the fifth, you're overwhelmed. Now you're at 10, and you can't process anymore. Your emotional system has hit capacity. There's no more room. Every new piece of suffering that comes in just bounces off, because you're full. Affective overload is what happens when you're exposed to more emotional input than your system can handle. You're not choosing to stop caring. Your capacity to absorb new emotions has maxed out. The system is protecting itself by shutting down intake. You're not indifferent. You're saturated. The triggers are volume and intensity. One severe trauma can overload you, or many smaller stressors accumulating over time. Either way, you hit a threshold where your emotional processing can't keep up with the incoming data. And once you cross that line, new information doesn't get processed. It gets rejected. You see this in crisis responders after major disasters. The first day, they're present, empathic, fully engaged. By day 3, they're mechanical. Not because they stopped caring, because their systems are overloaded. The empathy is still there in principle, but the capacity to feel it has been exceeded. Affective overload creates a paradox. The people who need help the most are the ones you can't feel for anymore, because by the time you reach them, you're already full. So the 10th person in crisis gets less empathy than the first, even though their need is identical. It's not fair. It's just how the system works. The only solution is offloading. You have to process and release the accumulated emotion before you can take in more. But processing takes time. And in high-demand environments, time isn't available. So you stay overloaded. And the longer you stay overloaded, the less you can feel at all. Affective overload isn't apathy. It's a circuit breaker. Your system has too much current running through it, so it shuts down to prevent damage. And until the load decreases, the empathy stays offline. Empathy repair. You've been running on empty. The empathy that used to come naturally feels forced. You're going through the motions, but the connection isn't there. And you know something needs to change. But you're not sure if the capacity to care can even be rebuilt. Or if it's just gone. Empathy repair is the process of restoring empathic capacity after it's been depleted or damaged. It's not automatic. It requires intentional effort. But it is possible. The system that broke down can be rebuilt. It just takes time, space, and practices that actively restore connection instead of demanding more of it. The first step is stopping the drain. You can't refill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. If you're still in the environment that depleted you, repair won't happen. You need distance. Physical, emotional, temporal. Enough separation from the constant empathic demands that your system can start to recover instead of continuing to deplete. The second step is reconnection with yourself. Burnout happens when you're so focused on others that you lose track of your own needs. Repair requires turning that attention inward, not selfishly, practically. What do you need? What do you feel? What restores you? You can't care for others from a place of self-neglect. So repair starts with self-empathy. The third step is small doses of positive connection, not high-stakes caregiving, just low-pressure reciprocal interactions. Conversations where you're not responsible for fixing anything. Relationships where empathy flows both ways. These interactions remind your system that connection can be nourishing instead of draining. And that reminder starts to rebuild trust in empathy itself. Recovery isn't linear. Some days you'll feel capable. Others, the numbness returns. That's normal. You're not broken permanently. You're healing. And healing from empathic depletion takes longer than people expect because the damage was cumulative. The repair has to be too. Empathy repair doesn't promise you'll return to who you were before. But it offers the possibility of becoming someone who can care again without it costing everything. And for people who've lost their empathy to burnout, that possibility is enough. Compassionate presence. They don't need you to fix it. They don't need advice. They don't need you to make it better. They just need you to be there. Fully there. Not distracted. Not planning your response. Not trying to solve anything. Just present with them in their experience. Not doing. Just being. This is compassionate presence. The ability to sit with someone suffering without needing to change it. You're not absorbing their pain. You're not detaching from it. You're holding space. Witnessing. Offering the gift of being seen and not being alone. It's harder than it sounds. Most people's instinct when faced with suffering is to fix it, to offer solutions, to minimize the pain, anything to make the discomfort stop. But compassionate presence requires you to resist that urge, to let the person feel what they're feeling without rushing them through it or trying to make it go away. The power isn't in what you say. It's in what you don't say. You're not filling the silence with empty reassurances. You're allowing the silence to hold them. Your presence communicates that their pain is bearable. Not because you've fixed it, but because you're willing to sit in it with them. And that willingness is more valuable than any advice. Hospice workers practice this constantly. They can't cure the dying. They can't stop the grief. But they can be present. And for people facing the end, that presence, someone willing to stay when there's nothing left to fix, is everything. Compassionate presence requires emotional regulation. You have to be stable enough that their distress doesn't destabilize you. But you also have to be open enough that they feel your genuine care. It's the balance between empathy and boundary. You're with them, but you're not drowning with them. It's a skill. Not everyone has it naturally, but it can be learned. And once you understand that sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer is simply being there, not fixing, not solving, just being, you realize that compassion doesn't always require action. Sometimes it just requires presence.